Sorry, thanks for that. Is my mic muted? Yes, that was great. Right, I will start again. Thanks for the follow for Faust and Ask a Philosopher, and thank you for prompting that mic muted. It was muted because I started 10 minutes before just to start it, and I didn't want to just, have background noise. And then you forget to take it off. Silly. Anyway, welcome to the Philosophy Research Discussion, 21st of September 2020. I wasn't here last week. We were having new windows fitted in the house on the Tuesday, so Monday night was just chaos and everything was being moved around, and so it was just impractical. For those of you who don't know, the Philosophy Research Discussions are things that take place in between my courses, in between when I'm teaching, and I teach for the Free University of Brighton. And we teach in term times, normal sort of term times. My next course starts in 2 weeks on the 5th of October and is on Plato and Deleuze, where we'll be reading some Plato, specifically the Phaedrus, the Sophist and the Statesman, and then we'll be looking at various extracts from Deleuze's work, where he kind of where he's critical or critiquing Plato, in particular around a notion of a thing called the simulacrum, a word you don't need to worry about at the moment, but if you're interested in the course and you're from the Free University of Brighton, then you can sign up on River, which just means go to the forum and join the forum. And if you're not from the Free University of Brighton, then on my Twitch page there are links to a Discord that you're more than welcome to join and chat along with. I will probably put the course materials on that Discord as well as on River for the Free University of Brighton people, particularly if there's anyone there. And so what do I do in these sessions in between? Well, it's a mixture of conversations with other people. Sometimes my partner, who's working away behind me, isn't available today, unfortunately, because she's busy working. Sometimes they're conversations with other people, but usually what I try and do is just report on what I'm doing during the week as a philosopher. So this is my kind of philosophy in practice, philosophy in public, doing it in public, looking like a bit of a weirdo with your pants on your head and all that kind of stuff, because obviously most of the time when you encounter philosophy, you encounter it as written and as something that's been kind of polished and presented and organised either within the academy or in some other form. And if it's not written, then it's in a very formal presentation, which are quite often written, as it happens, in a strange way. So I'm talking about philosophy conferences here, where you go to a conference and someone talks to you for 20 minutes or half an hour, but what they actually do is they read something that they've written, and occasionally you'll have a conference where those papers will be given out beforehand and you'll actually have a space for conversations. But most of the time we encounter philosophy nowadays as written, and so this is part of a practice of trying to not get back to an idea where philosophy isn't written, but get back to an idea where we're not just seeing the finished product, which is one of the difficulties when we encounter writing. Now that's changed a little bit, of course, with blogs, and there are people who are blogging, and I think of that as a little bit like philosophy in public. And I do have a blog you're more than welcome to look at, notebook11.com. Again, there are links on my Twitch page. But the idea of these sessions, as I say, is to sort of explore this curious space of Twitch and streaming as a way of maybe having a kind of a way of doing philosophy in practice, philosophy in public. Anyway, so what have I been up to this week? Well, me and my co-writing partner, we're working on this book called The Freudian Spaceship, and we're in a new phase of writing. We spent June, July, August, so during COVID lockdown mainly, having a weekly conversation where we would, which we were recording, and we'd track those conversations, where we could try to develop what we were working on. Postdoctoral researcher being the best way to describe yourself. I'm not a professor, those are Americans. The only way you get to be a professor in England is if you're a head of department usually, or unless you've gone to America beforehand. I'm an independent philosopher, so postdoctoral researcher, yeah, that's kind of a thing. So where was I? Yeah, so me and Eric Harper, whom I'm writing the book with, so we had a series of conversations that we tracked and recorded, and then we also did a series of conversations with other people, in particular because our work is exploring a kind of connection between colonial and racist situations within capitalism and the climate change. So we've been doing that sort of work during the lockdown, and now we're in another write-up period. So I'll share a little bit of that text later, just as part of the practice I'm doing. Some people in the previous sessions have had other bits of the text sort of shared with them. I think that's probably the easiest way of putting it. So that's one of the things I've been up to this week, doing some of that writing, and also obviously been doing some more research. And I came across a couple of interesting pieces this week, one of which was particularly it was a shortish article by someone called Sarah Salem, who is part of the Historical Materialism editorial board, and it was called A Revolutionary Lifeline, Teaching Fanon in a Post-Colonial World. It's from 2017. And one of the things that was interesting about that piece, it obviously it's about Fanon. One of the things, and it's her reflections on teaching Fanon, and the reaction and responses to teaching Fanon in the UK, and particularly in the context of Brexit and the earlier sort of incarnations of Black Lives Matter following Eric Garner. And so it's an interesting piece because one of the reasons I was sort of struck by it was actually an academic reflecting on their practice, particularly their practice of teaching, and those moments where where an academic or particularly a philosopher reflects on their own practice in terms of what they're learning from the people around them. They often feel a lot more open than when they're just telling us what's going on. So there was an interesting sort of dynamic there. But one of the things that really did push into my mind was the kind of development of readings of Fanon and how this has been continuously a site of struggle and redevelopment. And obviously, well, not obviously, but my work with Eric, what we're doing with that is we're working with the schizoanalysis and Fanon. We both have an interest in schizoanalysis and have been sort of Eric's a psychoanalyst, and so we've both got a strong interest for a few years now in Guattari, perhaps more than Deleuze, but schizoanalysis generally. And we're working with Fanon in combination with that. And obviously Fanon himself was a psychoanalyst. And so we're drawing upon the kind of background Freudian and drive-orientated dynamics in that as we explore kind of, as I say, these issues of racial capitalism and climate change. And the idea of that text was for us to, in a sense, learn something new. We were both very familiar with Fanon, but we were encountering a particular situation in the world which everyone encounters, and obviously which is not getting any better at the moment, of extreme levels of racial injustice and extreme levels of catastrophe around climate that just doesn't seem to be able to be dealt with. And the kind of our anger and fury in relationship to these things, and it's kind of those elements that we were working with there. So Fanon's a very interesting sort of element of that, and Sarah Salem's piece was good because it really kind of began to, in particular in another essay that she was writing, where she talks about stretching Fanon's idea of stretching Marxism. What Sarah Salem was doing was beginning to show me something that I had kind of known but had forgotten, which was this huge historical set of arguments. Fanon plays this role of a kind of where he comes to the fore again in certain sort of situations. As a site of dispute about what he really means and about how to really deal with him. And obviously, me and Eric are working with him again, and he's obviously big and popular again. That's it's a kind of replication of that, and so it's worth looking into the background of those particular disputes, some of which I was kind of half familiar with, but a good piece. So if you've not come across the work of Sarah Salem, I can recommend that, particularly if you're interested in Fanon and Marxism. So some good stuff there. Yeah, one of the other pieces I came across this week that kind of struck a chord and made me think. It's a very short piece, on a blog called Synthetic Zero, which I don't read an awful lot, to be honest, but I do occasionally. It comes through on my feed, and I occasionally have a look at it. And as I say, it's quite a short piece, so I'll kind of just track through it. Essentially, it's just an account of a new book by someone called Katharina Pistol, called The Code of Capital, from Columbia University. She's a Columbia University law professor. And I'll just read a little bit of Synthetic Zero's blog. Pista explains how capital is created behind closed doors in the offices of private attorneys, and why this little-known fact is one of the biggest reasons for the widening wealth gap between the holders of capital and everybody else. Rather than, and this is the bit that kind of struck me and I was interested in, rather than deploying some lazy occult conception of capital as an objective force, Pista argues that the law selectively codes certain assets, endowing them with the capacity to protect and produce private wealth. With the right legal coding, any object, claim or idea can be turned into capital, and lawyers and their wealthy masters are the keepers and programmers of this code. Pista analyses and makes clear the linkages between present-day patterns of wealth inequality and market-centric policy shifts from the 1980s, especially economic and legal reforms. Pista demonstrates that to hold capitalism accountable, or to intervene on the codes of capital, it is necessary to be cognizant of the specificity of capitalist processes and how capital is actually made. Now, what was there were some odd little bits here. There's a kind of dismissal of certain sort of ways of thinking of capital as kind of occulted, that I kind of have sympathy with, but it seemed a little bit dismissive. But what was really interesting is this idea that when we're talking about capitalism in particular, often we're talking at a very abstract level. And we talk about the state in the same way. We talk about it in this very abstract level. And in fact, one of the things that's I think crucial to sort of take from schizoanalysis in some sense, and to a certain extent, again with Fallon looking at the relationships of colonial life, is the detail and the sort of I'd say the word specificity, but it's a bit of a jargony word. The kind of the intimate, everyday features of how people do things, the habits and the kind of languages that they do things with. And it reminded me of a discussion that took place in the late 80s in the Socialist Journal, in the Socialist Society, and this was people like Ralph Miliband, where they were very interested in, because they were interested in a project of using the state for socialist transformation. One of the things they were very interested in were details like educational background, and even more intimate details like dress codes. And how, if they were going to actually enable the state to become a tool for production of socialism, they'd need to reorganize the culture within the state formations, the people that actually are the state, or are the operative sort of technicians of the state. And in order to do that, they would have to pay attention to what nowadays we might call micropolitics. They'd have to pay attention to things like dress codes, educational backgrounds, all these kind of things. And so when Synthetic Zero is pointing to Pista and the way in which she sort of is identifying the legal details, the tons and tons of legal details that go into making up capitalism, I think this is a really important kind of a really important redress to that abstract notion of capitalism. But at the same time, there's also this kind of strange idea in all of these things that somehow it's as easy as changing the details to change the event or to change the horizon, and I think that's a kind of that would be pushing the situation too far. If you're going to change the world, or if you're going to change the horizon in which we live, then paying attention to details is absolutely crucial, and making things real, working out how to make things real is kind of absolutely crucial. But I think there's something missing in these accounts where it's somehow just a matter of changing the details, just a matter of changing the personnel, just a matter of changing the way things are done. in order to sort of have a radical change. I think it kind of misses a very strong sense in which even if we change the detail, there are a whole series of kind of inertias or dynamics. These are things that we pick up with the word desires, for example. But there's a whole kind of series of these things that are simply not capable of being brought under a domain of reason or choice. And I think this is a kind of crucial element that is brought forward by a kind of Marxist notion of class struggle, but also by a schizoanalyst, where there are a whole bunch of stuff crucial to focus on, absolutely vital to think about changing, but which are kind of not themselves the cause or the source of themselves. They're kind of effects, and so in a sense, if you change the details, you can maybe change the effects and the presentation of those effects, but it doesn't really necessarily address the sort of underlying dynamics. Now, anyway, there's a kind of whole problematic there of this of like looking at what are the actual dynamics of capitalism, what are the real sort of core elements of it, as it were. What would you really need to change in order to change capitalism? And that, I mean, I don't have any answers to that. That's not an easy issue. Well, one of the things I do think is it's not just simply a matter of assuming that it's making better choices. I don't think capitalism is somehow the result of a series of bad choices that some people made. I think it's a result generally of a series of good, in inverted commas, choices, or choices that work for people. And the question is why are they working for people? Why do those particular choices, how are they enabled to work? And so there's a couple of bits that both of which sort of were productive this week to my thoughts. I'm gonna be teaching in 2 weeks now, Plato and Deleuze, and so this is to move on a little bit. So I've been moving some of my research time away from just dealing with schizoanalysis, Fanon, and capitalism into preparing for teaching. And so there's been a certain amount of my time now that I've been spending, as I say, prepping for teaching. Oh, hang on. Let's go back to that. Do I think capitalism is something that humans will into being, as opposed to a primordial-ish force or principle? Yeah, that's essentially my problem, in a sense. Is I'm not sure that it is something that I'm not sure it's something that anyone willed into being. So I'm not sure it's something anyone can will out of being. I wouldn't want to call them primordial, but yeah, there's a kind of an organisation that takes place. A way of things being organised that I think is almost more crucial. You can argue about that in chat. Yeah, I mean, I suppose. I suppose if you think about it in terms of something like a school, there are certain sort of features of educational practice that depend upon the way in which that school is organised, and that you can change and that you can make a difference to, and so you can see different comparative pedagogies. You say in a compulsory secondary education in the UK, you're meant to be able to learn to read, very quickly and early. If you compare it with something like Steiner schools, then they take a different kind of background ontology, and they don't even bother trying to teach people to learn to read till 7. The end result, by the time they're 12, is everyone's roughly at the same bloody place. And so there's different ways of getting to the same goal that depend upon how things are organised. And I think, in a sense, that's kind of how I think capitalism is. It's a different way of getting to the same goal, and the goal is for us to be able to fulfil our needs, in a sense. And I think what's difficult about thinking of capitalism as something like a negative or a bad moral choice is that it's for large chunks of people it's a fucking catastrophic choice, but it's for a lot of other people not really a choice at all. It's just something that they do. And I think the same kind of thing needs to be sort of grounded if we're thinking about moving beyond capitalism. Is we have to be able to provide ways in which people can do what they need to do that will take them in a different dynamic, in a different direction from the core dynamics of capitalism. And so I think it's at that point that you need to sort of think, what are the core problematics of capitalism? And I think the core problematics of capitalism is it's deeply is deeply self-generating, and this comes to what Marx called the general form of the commodity, money. Anyway, I'm gonna get back to this, and I'll talk about this at another time again. And people obviously have lots of different ideas about this. I suppose the point I was making was, and this is to do with this figure of the revolutionary that I'm working with, is that capitalism can't be changed simply by tinkering with elements that somehow can be done better. There needs to be something else that takes place, quite fundamental in terms of the dynamics that you're trying to alter. Anyway, I'm going to move, as I say, to some of the stuff I've been looking at, and this has a connection, I think. So as I say, I'm teaching the Plato and Deleuze in a couple of weeks, and one of the things that's really interesting about reading Plato again, because I haven't read Plato for 2 or 3 years at least, possibly longer, is the huge shift in tone of now obviously that sounds like trivial in a sense, but when you go back and you read the Platonic dialogues, you immediately enter into this completely different relationship to philosophy. In most contemporary philosophy, there is not all of it by any means, although the vast majority perhaps, there's this just assumed knowledge. I'm kind of being addressed as though the person that's talking to me knows exactly what they think, knows exactly how things work, and somehow I've got something to learn from them. And the possibility of dialogue is at best difficult, and at worst it just impossible, not even allowed. And there's this continual sort of sense in which the language in which I read philosophy, particularly contemporary philosophy, is constantly searching for a kind of new fashionable space, a new way of expressing itself, but never really doing an awful lot, other than I suppose replicating a kind of I don't want to just rag on at the academy, but it kind of replicates a way in which the academy teaches, which is you're taught to sort of mimic how things have been done before within a relatively recent past, and you begin to mimic that, and if you mimic it well and you begin to say something new, then you might be able to step forward. And it's that, I suppose, sense in which there's always has to be something new said that you just don't find when you go back to Plato, obviously. Because it's all bloody new in some sense at that point. But the other thing that's curious about the pedagogic change is that it's very difficult to read Plato without thinking, in some sense, that you're engaged in something like a therapeutic practice. It's very difficult to do because there's this, even if it's just which character are you inside the dialogue, who where do you fit inside the dialogue? There's this very sort of strong sense of the therapeutic relationship. Or let's put that a bit more clearly, of the idea that philosophy is there to do something to you. And this is not, I don't think, a contemporary relationship to philosophy. Philosophy is something that we, are able to do, to other people with. We can use it to do things with. But philosophy at its best is always most interesting when it does something to you. And in particular when it does something to you that you didn't even know, could be done, wanted to be done, needed to be done. And I think a lot of the time when I see people who are engaged in philosophical research, particularly in the sense doctoral researchers, but anyone who's engaged in trying to write something or think about something that they don't understand, the process of them understanding, the process of them, moving from reading a text that makes no bloody sense at all, or very little sense. The process of them moving from that position of going, oh God, what on earth is Heidegger going on about? What on earth is this person saying? The process of moving from that position to the position in which you can kind of go, right, I kind of can see this point and this point and this point. I can see why they've done it this particular way. That process is central to the teaching of philosophy, and it's central to the practice of philosophy, and to a certain extent it's central to the practice of philosophical research to a certain extent, but it's almost as though this was a side effect. It's almost thought of as though this was a side effect. Of course, we have to move from a position where we don't understand to one where we do. This kind of dynamic is just a kind of generic dynamic. It's not really specific. It's not really philosophical. And what I'm actually trying to get to is a point at which I can list a series of arguments and I can run through them quickly and I can run through the counter arguments, and I can play the game accurately and well. And that process of learning is kind of forgotten. And it's one of the things that attracted me originally to Deleuze, in particular to difference and repetition, which is what I did all my doctoral research on. And it was exactly for that reason. It was specifically, I started with a book called What is Philosophy, which just really, really interested me because of its mobilization of concept of affect. But I quickly moved to difference and repetition and spent 3-4 years working on difference and repetition. In this process of trying to clarify things for myself, trying to get something that seemed impenetrable to be accessible, at least to me. And you go through a series of these kind of moments of what as a sorcerer I might call gnosis. So you go through this series of moments of things clicking, things fitting into each other in a way that makes sense. And those moments, one of the things that interested me in Deleuze was that these moments are absolutely fundamental for Deleuze. These are not side effects. He talks very, very clearly about this relationship to apprenticeship rather than and to kind of a process of learning that is much more embodied, much more embedded in the way in which you operate and activate yourself than in the head. And I think that's one of the things that always attracts me to certain philosophers is how much that the work of that particular philosopher, how much that is able to do to you. And so when I think of going back to Plato, and there's obviously a huge kind of background to thinking of Plato as therapeutic. There's a whole series of different people that have explored this, but one of the things that I think of when I go back to Plato is specifically this kind of idea of philosophy as therapy, and in distinction from, and this is a bad distinction, I know this isn't going to work in the long term, so I need to find a different way of putting this, but there's that distinction between philosophy as therapy and philosophy as understanding. And I mean, in some ways, the best example of philosophy as understanding is Spinoza. And the most contradictory in some ways, because Spinoza has this very peculiar relationship in a book called The Ethics, his most important book in some ways. He has this very peculiar relationship to understanding, what he would call the third kind of knowledge. For him, there's three kinds of knowledge. The first is just gossip, if you like. The second is where you begin to sort of sort shit out yourself a little bit, and the third is where you fully sort shit out yourself, if you like. Yeah, those are pretty crude. But that third kind of knowledge, which he calls understanding, is a kind of has this very ambiguous dynamic because it's divine. That's kind of crucial. There's a kind of moment at which you're kind of moving into the space of the mind of God. And I always love a bit of Spinoza, but I've always found Spinoza quite difficult because he's a particular kind of philosopher for whom the idea of therapy is kind of not explicit and yet continually present. So he's a very interesting philosopher because of that kind of relationship he has to a kind of things that philosophy can do to you, but it's not his focus. But so I would sort of want to make a distinction, I think, between philosophy as therapy and philosophy as understanding. And Wittgenstein, who was also someone I was really interested in and haven't read for years now, Wittgenstein is possibly one of the most, particularly the later Wittgenstein, is one of the philosophers that would be sort of much more closely aligned with the idea of philosophy as therapy, where what you could see in a book called The Philosophical Investigations is Wittgenstein kind of working through bit by bit his own confusions, his own senses of this can't be right. How does this work? And again, one of the things that's curious about the Philosophical Investigations is, in order to do that, there's a whole series of these little dialogues that take place, a to and a fro. There's a dialectic, maybe a jargon word, but the word dialectic just in a sense means a kind of dialogue, kind of. So Wittgenstein's therapeutics, as I say, often arise from his from a direct encounter with his own problem. And I think if there's a distinction to be made that makes any difference between the idea of philosophy as therapy and one as understanding, is it kind of depends upon what you think you're doing when you're doing philosophy. And one of the reasons this is kind of circling around in my head is because when me and Eric are writing our text at the moment, Kierkegaard is actually another example of very, very therapeutic philosopher. I always use Kierkegaard when I teach existentialism as a starting point in some ways for that, precisely for that reason. And I do think, I wouldn't say it's the problem with Wittgenstein is that he really seems strictly therapy only for himself. That is a difficulty, but it is. But his problems are also other people's problems. His problems don't simply belong within his own skin, although they're encountered from within his own skin. And I think that's what interests me about them, is that the problems are not, as it were, the problems are in some sense outside of him, but what's interesting is that the problem is only real because of his relationship to it. And so that I kind of think, yes, he seems unable to tolerate any knots whatsoever. And I think that's a great response, actually. I think it's great to get frustrated with someone like Wittgenstein. He can be enormously frustrating. I'm biased in a sense because I fell in love with Wittgenstein through the Tractatus, not through the Philosophical Investigations, and I also find the Philosophical Investigations to have that response of being frustrating. But as I say, the interesting thing that I'm kind of thinking about here, and this comes back to my own practice, is when me and Eric are working, what it is we're trying to do, because one of the things we tried to avoid from the start was producing a theory. We didn't want to produce another bloody theory. There's lots and lots of theories out there. They're great. Some of them work well, some of them work terribly. The vast majority of them, I've got no idea whether they're, whether I can choose between one painting and another painting. Some of them are more beautiful for me and others are less beautiful. And so, a theory is kind of an aesthetic for me in a sense, depending upon what it can do. In the same way that, I ride a motorbike, in the same way that a motorbike is an aesthetic as much as anything else. It's a kind of what can it do, and it has a kind of style to it. And so we didn't want to write a theory. We didn't want to work on theories. So we were trying to write from an embedded position, not ignoring our anger, not ignoring our fury, not ignoring our emotional responses, not ignoring kind of the way in which we're affected and impinged by everything that takes place around us, in the news and in political discussions, in the pub, in work. And so we ended up writing the first kind of section of this text, which we called Breath. And the text is organised into three sections: breath, body, and earth. And we organised this. We wrote this whole first section. It took us about a year. Lots of stuff were going backwards and forwards, and we sort of, had about 80,000 bloody words. Lots of it all over the place. Trimmed it down to about 25. And then we didn't. And then we put it aside for I think 6 months, a year, and started talking about other things. And now we're just coming back to that to move on, and we're actually doing this kind of specific reflection on what's going on in that particular text, and so that's prompted me to think about how as a philosopher you're able to, how you're able to work. Because for someone like Eric, he's a psychoanalyst, and so he's got a different kind of relationship to the role of the voice and the mind, the role of the voice and the thought, if you like, because of his engagement with those techniques in a therapeutic environment, in practice, if you like, where they do something or they don't do something, but where you learn what they can do and what they can't do with another person, with other people. Whereas for philosophy, this is a much more complicated kind of process. It is interesting at the Free University of Brighton because we don't obviously have the same kind of structures of teaching that occur in sort of normal universities. But one of the things that generally I would say is that most of the time, philosophers inside a university don't learn much from their students. They should, and I think they can, don't get me wrong, but they don't. And you kind of get this bias where you often find philosophy lecturers not really wanting to teach undergraduates. They want to teach postgrads and all this kind of stuff because they think they can have an interesting conversation, and they can almost, always have a more interesting conversation because they're on the same sort of page. And one of the things that they kind of try and avoid is that the naive question, the naive resistance in particular that you encounter when you teach someone who's new to philosophy, or an undergrad, if you like, inside a normal university, where, and I used to work at Greenwich, which was had a lot of working class students in it, and they didn't, not all of them, but a lot of them didn't really have a kind of kowtow to authority kind of response. So if they thought something was bullshit, they'd just say it was bullshit, and you would have to try and really work to say, right, it's not complete bullshit because there's this reason, there's this possibility that you could use it here, it makes sense of this, it makes sense of that, and you'd have to really kind of explain the practicalities of, and sometimes the practicalities would be there's no practicality here, this is just an interesting, uselessness that we can, and that kind of generates a series of exercises for us to work through. So that in particular Leibniz, for example, this is a kind of, often there's a kind of uselessness to some of the arguments, but it's like, well, what can we do? How far can we go? How far can we push reason if we do this kind of thing? And so it's not just about a kind of simple practicality, but it is kind of about, in a sense, the question was always, what can this do for me? And from that question, you can ask, you can begin to push it into what can it do to me. And I think that's kind of what I'm interested in doing with the text. But of course, in this text that I'm working on with Eric, but the difficulty there is whilst me and Eric are in conversation and dialogue, the way in which texts are organised and the way in which the production of text is organised is so peculiar in many ways, that you don't really get that response. You don't really get that kind of, it pushes you. The way in which writing is organised in sense is it pushes you to this kind of moment of producing a theory, producing a kind of clean theoretical tool that you can send out there like a, fully formed child or something. When in fact what we want to produce is something that's whole and but fragmentary, something that's not finished in a sense, and that is open to being developed in different kind of ways. It's 20 to 7 and I only really chat for about an hour tops, so what I'm just going to do, having rambled around that for a bit, is just give a little bit of the text, a chunk that we're working on at the moment. It's a very short-ish thing, and then we'll see where we're going. So as I say, this is a kind of bit of the writing that we've been doing this week. Can the body host the breath? What can be seen across the world in the contemporary moment is the problem of the breath, of breathing. In the previous section of this text, which we have called Breath, we try to express our encounters with this moment, a moment we call the time of the last breath. It is not an analysis, but an attempt to think about some of the ways that we've had our own breath taken away, as it were, when faced with what seems like a slow, horrific descent into a suffocating world. It takes our breath away to see the levels of violence against black people in America. It takes our breath away to see the forest fires, to read about the dying oceans, to listen to stories of disaster, death and destruction that seem to be so unnecessary. It takes our breath away to see such deliberate disaster. This list could go on so long we run out of breath. What takes our breath away perhaps most of all, what is almost too obvious to have to acknowledge, is that this is deliberate disaster. In the face of this deliberate disaster, what kind of response can we cope with? Tears, anger, frustration, desolation, all these affects flow through us just as they also flow through our communities. Grief is perhaps the easiest way to describe this. Grief is also a troublesome idea, however. In grief we encounter the death of the loved one, whether they were family or community or even just an image. Yet in grief we encounter death as it is, arriving from the outside to cleave open the present, placing some into the realm of the ancestors, whilst leaving others bereft of a future. As we move through grief, we regain a future, this time reconfigured to include a new set of ancestors, where the people we grieve for take their place. This new future, with our new ancestors, reorganises us. We become a new person, perhaps a child without a parent, or a partner without their companion. The grief recedes as the new future arrives. It is for this reason that grief, whilst perhaps the easiest way to describe our response to the contemporary moment, is insufficient as a concept. In grief, death has arrived. Yet in our contemporary moment, death is becoming the horizon of life, no longer arriving from the outside, but now embedded into the future of our present life. In grief, death arrives and a new future is opened, whereas in our contemporary moment, death is coming, always coming, and the future appears increasingly as forever closed. Extinction is not death. It is far worse. It is the destruction of the future and the loss of the ancestors. This transformation encounters death no longer as an outside that interrupts, rather death now becomes us. Is it any wonder that the fascination with zombies has grown so much in the last decade or two? Our collective unconscious expresses itself in stories of a living death and living with a living death. Giving the weight of this terror, how are we to live? We acknowledge that in expressing our encounter with the contemporary moment within the breath text, we present yet another dying light. We might describe ourselves as war-weary, having been trapped inside the class war all our lives, played out across multiple spaces in multiple ways. We still feel, but we also know that to feel is to fear, and fear is the mind killer. How to deal with this? How is it possible to look into our contemporary moment and feel, without becoming numb, without relying on some kind of moral heroism, where we force ourselves to face things? These strategies of facing reality are presented as simple moral choices. But if we have learned anything as psychoanalysts, philosophers, or revolutionaries, it is that the desire to live outruns any moral choices that might need to be faced up to. The difficulty is that this desire to live is too often channeled by capitalism in a self-destructive direction, either into individualism or into group dynamics that depend upon a border or other against whom the group defines itself. Whilst we would agree with the slogan, "Don't mourn, organise," quite what has to be organised is still unclear. What we think is that what needs to be organised is a new life. This is perhaps our proposal, if we had one, if we were able to make one. It is to the question of life that we must turn our face, if we want to think and live beyond the moment of the last breath. How can we think about life? Perhaps here the breath plays its most interesting role, as both a fact and concept, as a way of getting to grips with life. Life breathes. We might almost go so far as to say that life is primarily breath, the drive to breathe easily. The earth breathes, the organism breathes. There is even a kind of historical or temporal breath operating at a scale of the global climate and ecosystem. Fundamentally, breath is a metabolic dynamic, the core thread of changes and movements of energy that constitute life. Without breath, death. Yet the breath cannot be abstracted from the breathing bodies, as it entwines the corporeal and incorporeal in a process that produces the life that is both embodied and entangled, connected. In breathing, the body is infiltrated by the world, no longer distinct, but incorporated into a system, into a web of struggling, squirming survival. To think about life, then, is to think about the breath as it is hosted within the system of bodies. Is the breath constricted? Is it full? Does it gasp or struggle? Or is it easy and calm? From the panic attack to the dreaming body, the breath is hosted by the bodies it flows through, sometimes held, sometimes released. In our contemporary moment, we claim the way in which the breath is encountered is quite specific. It is encountered as limited from the outside, in what we have called the chokehold. The breath is held captive, not hosted, not welcomed, not treated as the stranger that needs somewhere to rest before moving on. We live within a system that is a poor host to the breath, treating it like a slave or possession when it needs to be welcomed as our necessary outsider. So our question, can the body host the breath, is a way for us to try and think about whether change, revolution, could be made real, whether and how we can become good hosts. This plays out across the system as a whole, as well as within the specific bodies each of us is. It ranges across the possibilities for climate survival, as well as the breathing practices of the person attempting to find a way to live within a world of the chokehold. It ranges from the figure of the revolutionary, to that of the psychoanalyst, to the sorcerer at the edge of the field, each of whom offers ways of breathing that have potential for loosening the grip of the chokehold. So it is through this question, can the body host the breath? And these figures, the revolutionary, the psychoanalyst, and the sorcerer, that we begin to try and think about a future beyond grief, beyond the chokehold, and within the present. So I just wanted to read that. I mean, the idea, obviously, is kind of fairly clear there, in a sense. But what's interesting to me at the moment is this kind of the way in which the writing text, when you're writing or working with the text and you're trying to kind of get a dynamic narrative and a set of consistent concepts, and you're trying to sort of organize the connections of those concepts, the way in which this kind of becomes too tidy, it becomes too straightforward, and at any moment you're going to resist it. At any moment you're going to think, no, I don't like that particular phrase, or that doesn't work, or this particular idea, and you end up either going with it, and it's one of the things I often have to tell my students is when you first encounter a difficult philosophical text, read it like a novel. The reason being is like, just go with it for a bit. You have to kind of go with it for a bit. And so when you're writing a text, you're kind of in this situation where you're kind of trying to produce something that people have to kind of go with, at least for a bit, and yet at each moment they can resist, or they can sort of, they can drift away. They can say, fuck it, no, don't like that. They can put the book down, which is, we all do this. Whereas in class or in dialogue or in discussion, and in Plato's dialogues, even to a certain extent poorly sometimes, this kind of continual resistance, this relationship of resistance, is positive. And so, this speaks to something that's kind of, and I'm going to end on this kind of point. This speaks to something that's kind of crucial about the relationship, and this is arriving at reading the Phaedrus again. And for anyone who knows Derrida and God knows all like that, there's tons of this stuff in Derrida. Derrida reads the Phaedrus really interestingly, but this kind of arises out of the Phaedrus, where the idea of the dialectic, I said I'd come back to that word, the idea of the dialectic is that, in a sense, two people in good faith, not trying to defeat each other, not trying to outsmart each other, not trying to show how clever they are necessarily, were two people in good faith, which in Plato's terms means with a love for the truth, engage in an attempt to try and produce that relationship to the truth together. And what's crucial about that is it assumes that philosophy can't be done on its own. It assumes that philosophy is related to other people and is only capable of being done in relationship to other people or other things. It kind of denies the possibility that philosophy is something that comes out of your head, comes out of your mind, comes out of your intelligence, comes out of you, some sort of fucking source of your ideas, and pushes you into this relationship with other people. It pushes, you're reading this relationship dialogue when you're often reading it in a class, and you're in this relationship dialogue, and then people wander off and they think they can write their essay or whatever on their own in their room. They can write their book and they can put one name to it. They can behave like an individual when everything that philosophy is kind of telling them from the beginning is that this is not possible. You can't behave like an individual if you want to engage in a relationship to the truth. It simply makes no fucking sense. And I think this is what I mean. I think this is what I mean when I think of philosophy as therapy. Is that it's not about trying to change or alter an individual. It's about trying to reorganize how we think of thinking, away from a practice in which we think we can do it ourselves, and actually to almost put down a claim even stronger, which is, there is no way you can think on your own, and to realize that is kind of the first step to being able to do something about stuff that often matters to you, whether it be your own personal life or politics. It's just not possible to do it on your own. And why that is, maybe I'll look at and think about maybe for next week, possibly. Something else will probably distract me. That's the other problem I have as a philosophy researcher, is I'm often distracted and go down rabbit holes. Anyway, I will finish there for this week because it's coming up for 8. So for those who don't know and don't know the details, this is Philosophy Research Discussion. It takes place in between my classes. I teach philosophy at the Free University of Brighton, which is a radical alternative educational institute that has no money and takes no money, charges no money, and where everyone does everything for free, including the tutors and the students. And it's been one of the longest alternative education projects in Britain for a while now. We've been going about, God knows, 8 years, something like that, and based in Brighton. And so the classes and courses are for the students of the Free University of Brighton. Anyone else is welcome to join in with stuff that I am doing through the Discord on Twitch. And if you know the mantras of social media, I meant to say something like share, like, and subscribe, and all that sort of shit. Now I fucking no idea why people do that. I don't need to be told to do that. I just do that. So you feel free to do that if you want to. I don't really care one way or the other, to be honest, that much. I suppose I do a bit, but not that much. And as I say, if you want to get involved in the courses, check out the Twitch page, or if you're from the Free University of Brighton, come along to River. And I will maybe see other people next week. I hope to be here next week. And that's the lot for this week. Ta-ta all.